There's a relationship there. I don't mean to suggest they hate each other. They don't. It's a business relationship, though. The Saudis know that the Chinese don't have the military capacity to project past Taiwan, much less all the way to the Persian Gulf. But they also recognize that the Chinese are the world's largest oil importer, and the Chinese recognize that the Saudis are the world's largest oil exporter. So the idea that the two of them wouldn't have some sort of corporate economic relationship is equally silly. But there's only so far that you can take that. And as for the denomination issue, the Chinese were very clear at the BRICS summit that they had no interest in a post-dollar world. It's just that wasn't picked up by U.S. finance because it doesn't match the de-dollarization drama mantra that we're all talking about here. I mean, it's really not a discussion in Beijing or in Johannesburg or in New Delhi about the only country that feels that they have a strategic interest in a non-dollar world are the Russians, and they just want everyone to use the ruble, which is, of course, stupid. There's got to be an alternative. The yuan is not internationally exchanged. The rupee is a very soft currency. The Russian system is under sanctions, and the Brazilians have no idea what they're doing. There is no alternative here at all. The closest would have been the euro, but 10 years ago, when they were having their financial crisis, they started confiscating insured banks' deposits to pay for their bailouts, which eliminated any possibility of ever being the euro. And in the aftermath of the sanctions on Russia, the euro and the yen are de facto subsidiaries of the US dollar now. I mean, there's not even anyone who's pretending that they might be next. That the Russians have launched since 1991 and in an attempt to reshape their neighborhood. And if they succeed in Ukraine, Ukraine doesn't solve their strategic problems. They're trying to build a better external crustal defense. Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland solve that problem. So if Ukraine falls, we will have a different war, and one where the United States will have boots on the ground and nukes will fly. So blocking the Russians from advancing past Ukraine is a core national interest to the United States. In addition, the economics of this speak for themselves. You've got the world's #1 wheat exporter and #5 wheat exporter locked in a war. It involves the world's largest and third largest sources of potash fertilizer. It involves the world's second largest sources of oil and natural gas. The economics of this are immense. And so I can think of no better way of showing you that everyone who was Republican who could do math has been ejected from the party than talking about how Republicans are now against assisting a country that is a democracy if failed, an economic conduit that's critical in order to hold back a irredentist power that holds huge control over wide swaths of the global economic system. I mean, it's like this should be the type of conflicts that traditional Republicans are all about because it stops so many things. But instead, we've got this wing of the party that has managed to take over and clearly can't find Canada on a map or do basic math. We will find a way to make it work because the alternative is to risk losing American cities. We found out in the Battle of Kiev that the Russians were incompetent at modern warfare. They're not any good at logistics. Their training was atrocious. And the fact that you've got Ukraine, which functionally didn't have a military on the first day of this war, that it still exists, is a testament not necessarily to Ukrainian pluck and creativity, but Russian absolute and utter incompetence. And so if we see the Russians prevail in Ukraine, when they reach the NATO border, a fight between the NATO forces, who are the best in the world, and the Russians, who are definitely in the bottom half, would be a bloodbath, and the Russians would be obliterated. But that doesn't change any of their strategic needs. And so nukes would come into play. And the Biden administration, because it's led by a guy who predates the splitting of the atom, knows this in his gut, and we will find a way to make it work. The Russian demographic is one of the worst in the world. This is their last generation where they can try to use conventional military force to reshape it. They know that this is their last shot. They know that this is their last decade as a coherent conventional military power, despite all their flaws. And so they're going to push until they get to a border system that they can hold with a degrading internal system. That goes all the way to Warsaw. Sure. Well, I'm not worried about the next election. I'm pretty confident that Trump is going to face a landslide defeat. We can go into the logic of that later if you. But on the military question, there's a reason that the Biden administration has fast-tracked absolutely everything involving missile defense. Um, by the books, by the numbers, we certainly don't have enough missile defense to protect against a broad spectrum Russian strike. However, keep this in mind, every weapon system, every economic system that the Russians have used in the last 2 years has failed pretty dramatically. To think that all of the nukes are the one thing that works to spec, I think takes a little bit of analytical creativity. I would argue that the concern that this administration is going to have to deal with is what happens if we get to that point and Putin hits the big candy red button and nothing happens. What do you do with someone who attempts to kill 500 million people but fails? Basically, what the Biden administration is dealing with is the four previous administrations abdicated pretty much all global involvement. And while I can argue that the United States, because of its insulation and its economic structure and its demographic patterns, is actually in a really good spot for not just today, but for the long term, that does mean that there are a lot of things that have gone down that we've lost the ability to influence easily. This is one of them. Our biggest failure of the Clinton administration specifically, was ignoring the Soviet collapse and not managing the fallout. And we are still paying for that. We are still trying to clean that up. It certainly makes it messier. So until very recently, the United States was the only player in the game when it came to drones. We had drones of every size, from things the size of a grasshopper to things the size of a 737. What is unique about the American drone system, and so what we thought was true about all drone systems, was that they were expensive and they were in small numbers. American technology, when it comes to the military, has always been about quality over quantity, because wherever we go in the world, we will always be hideously outnumbered. So we've got to be able to punch harder at a further distance. And that's the Reapers, and that's the Predators, and that's the Special Forces drones, all of that. What we have seen in the last few years, however, is that there's a cheap approach, that there's nothing about the technology that says it has to be top notch. And if you make 50 really, really cheap ones, you can still do a lot of damage. Now, for the United States, I'd say that kind of the problems fall into two general categories. The number one is the new Joint Strike Fighter, which is supposed to be our only airborne weapons platform for the next 20 years. Its range is somewhat limited, and those little Iranian moped drones have greater range than the Joint Strike Fighter. So all of a sudden now, our weapons platform, to be perfectly blunt, is broadly useless. Because if they were to launch 1,000 of those things at a base where the JSF was based, one of them is going to get through, no matter how good your defenses are. So that limits the sort of military activity the United States can do, largely removes our ability to have air cover from ground installations. We'll have to do it only from naval platforms. The second problem we've got is anyone can do this. I mean, Hamas is many things, but an economic player, no. A technological player, no. And the fact that you can basically put these together in your garage and launch them by the dozens makes for a different sort of conflict. Now, that works both ways. And what the United States military is doing is something called the Replicator Initiative, where it will basically start using American resource scale to build Hamas-style drones. And the goal is to be able to independently attack 2,000 Chinese targets and destroy them within 24 hours using our naval platforms. So basically, things like destroyers and, God forbid, carriers just carry tens, if not hundreds of thousands of these things. And we just launch a